Hello, everyone. My name is Ellisbryn Johnson, and I am a University of Calgary master's student. I am currently studying under the supervisors of Dr. William Bridle and Dr. Kerry Din, both in the social cultural aspects of sport in the kinesiology faculty. Today, I'm going to present to you what my master's is going to be on in kind of an overarching topic of inclusion in sport. Specifically, I'm going to be looking at LGBTQI2S inclusion and activism in Canadian men's rugby. So while I get started here, I'd like to start by having the definitions of some terms I'm going to use quite freely throughout this presentation. I understand that not everyone's familiar with these terms, so I'm going to leave this up here and, while I read you a passage, feel free to take a glance and read a definition. Now, I'm going to read you a passage from the autobiography of Gareth Thomas. Now, Gareth Thomas is a Welsh rugby player. He's now retired, but he used to captain the national team. He's an incredible player, an incredible person, and he's also openly gay. So I'm going to read you a quick passage from his book. Now, I believe at this point, he himself has not come out, and he's still kind of uncomfortable. It seems like he's still kind of uncomfortable with his sexuality and the idea that he is gay. So, any smugness or complacency I may have slipped into disappeared one winter afternoon after I tackled my opposing wing, an English player, in a South Wales derby game. It's surprisingly intimate, a mano-a-mano activity, tackling. The ball had gone and our bodies remained locked together in what was probably a misguided attempt to gain a psychological advantage. He fixed me with a stare and hissed, "You're bent," which is a British homophobic term. As that brigand incident, I was electrified. He rolled away and rose to his feet, and in the fraction of a second it took me to realize that I had to restate my macho credentials. I had to convince him I was not some limp-wristed victim. Mine wasn't a subtle strategy, though. I basically beat him up whenever I had the opportunity. I spent the entire game chasing him around the field, promising heinous retribution. The code of the alpha male meant I had to impose my dominance on him physically so that he would begin to doubt the wisdom and the truth of his slur. I tried not to be too obvious, but in the second half, even my own teammates began asking questions. What's your problem with him? Why are you going after him so much? Why are you so wound up? Every time he had the ball, I would hit him as hard as I could, while remaining on the outer edge of the laws. If he struggled and attempted to get up, I'd put my hand on his face and push it into the mud. There are age-old ways and means to inflict punishment when you are set on operating just within the limits of legitimacy. He goes on to describe a couple of these, but I'm just going to jump to the end of this paragraph where he says, "My intention was to demoralize him." Now, in that example, that shows a lot, and it shows a lot about the current sports and inclusion. He talks about being macho and being the alpha male, and the fact that if he is the alpha male, he will therefore disprove any chance that he may be gay, and he may not be heterosexual in the eyes of his opponent. And really, that is a pretty aggressive term, thinking that he wants to demoralize his opponent in order to display this macho man. So I'm going to use that to kind of set the tone for my presentation here. Now, first I want to talk about just Canadian sports. And so I found some statistics from the Out on the Field studies. And these statistics are that 81% of participants have witnessed or experienced homophobia. 70% of participants say that youth sports are not safe for gay people. And 64% believe sport in Canada is worse for homophobia than the rest of society. There are two stats I really want to pull out of these three. And the first one is that 70% of participants believe that youth sports are not safe. Not safe. Safe is a huge term, but that is terrifying. Regardless how you want to define safe, the fact that these participants don't think that youth are safe in the concept of sport, a sport, something that should be inclusive and something that should be free for everyone and just enjoyable. it's not safe. The second part I wanted to talk about was that 64% believe that sport in Canada is worse for homophobia than the rest of society. Now, kind of going back to what I just said, sport, we view it as a social construct of where people can be physically active, enjoy kind of competitive nature environments. Anyone should be able to play. You just like, it's the skills. We talked about how popular soccer is and all you need is a ball and a net. That is the mentality. And yet, for some reason, with something that I believe is viewed as so open, is more exclusive than the rest of society that has all these other issues going on in it. So I found those quite interesting. I also wanted to use another study that told the story of Ferguson. Now, for a little background information here, Ferguson plays beer league hockey, and they go by the pronouns they and their, and they are non-binary. That's how they identify. And they describe their experience in a men's hockey locker room with this identity. And their quote is, typically men's hockey locker rooms aren't the most friendly to other identities and sexualities and all that stuff. Now, I pulled out that quote because that's a very casual way of just kind of describing where Canadian sport is right now. And yes, hockey's not rugby, but hockey's very Canadian. And it is, because of the physicality, it's viewed as very masculine, quite similar to how most view rugby. Next, I want to talk about kind of why men's sport. And so I pulled out another couple stats here from the Out on the Field studies. They talk about how 41% of gay men and 16% of lesbians in sport have been bullied. 26% of gay men and 13% of lesbians in sport have received verbal threats. 23% of gay men and 13% of lesbians in sport have been physically attacked. These stats are quite eye-opening. These are not small percentages we're talking about. Although there's no one cause of why the men's stats, the gay men's stats are higher than the lesbian stats. It may be a result of a larger population, may be a result of heteronormative masculinity, and that really pushes forth the idea that men in sport cannot be gay. But really, the fact that in some cases it shows double than the lesbian statistic here. We have 41% have been bullied, and that's just ridiculous. That is just wild. That is a wild statistic. So men's sport is clearly a long way from being inclusive, and women's sport too, but we're focusing on men for this lecture. Really, what these statistics show is that homophobic and misogynistic discourse are alive and well, and they are being acted as a means of social marginalization. So next, let's talk about masculinity. If we're talking about men's sport, it goes hand in hand with masculinity. And there are various types of masculinity. But before we really dive into that, I want to talk about sexuality and gender and the definitions between them. So I'm going to read you a few definitions that are from just Google and Oxford Dictionary, and they just describe what sex and gender is and what makes them up. So sex, for example, is two main categories: it's male and female, into which humans and most other living things are divided on the basis of their reproductive functions. Gender, on the other hand, is defined as the range of characteristics pertaining to and differentiating between femininity and masculinity. Sexuality is a person's identity in relation to gender or genders to which they typically are attracted to, aka sexual orientation. So applying this here, we have the fact that gender is quite closely linked to masculinity and femininity. However, sexual orientation is the attraction of genders. So therefore, is sexual orientation the attraction to masculinity and femininity? And is that almost the role that gender can play in sexuality at the end of the day? So using these three definitions, why are specific physical traits in sports used to determine sexuality? Why is masculinity determining sexuality? Why is the display of stereotypical femininity determining sexuality? So I'm going to use a study by Anderson and McGuire in 2010 to kind of describe the different types of masculinity that can be used. classic, some might want to say, is orthodox masculinity. And this is a form of masculinity that is predicted on homophobia, misogyny, physicality, and bravado. Now, really, this is just describing why it's disparaging to be called or insinuated as female or gay when you're a man in sports. If you are insinuated as one of those two identities, then you are perceived as weaker or lesser than the other male athletes that are either on your team or you're competing against, which is wild. However, masculinity isn't always necessarily a bad thing when it comes to sport. And so Anderson McGuire kind of talked about another form of masculinity called inclusive masculinity. Now, inclusive masculinity can exist with multiple masculinities being displayed, regardless of gender or sexuality, with no one type of masculinity being portrayed as dominant. That's kind of a confusing definition, but really what I believe it's trying to say is that regardless how you display masculinity, there is no one way to display it. You can still be masculine. Whether that means you're less physical than others, whether that means you're less competitive than others, whether you can demonstrate your masculinity however you feel necessary without someone saying, you know what, because that's not hegemonic masculinity, that's lesser than any other type of masculinity. So to put these two in perspective, I want to use an example. Now, the term bromance has really gained some steam over the last few years. And the idea of bromance is that it's an intimate connection between two male players or athletes that does not have any sexual attraction, but it does display a lot of the emotional connection, a physical connection. It has players saying, "I love you, man." It has all these other connotations that you would think would be perceived as gay when it comes to men's sport. However, that's not necessarily the case. So this is kind of an example of inclusive masculinity in the sense that it has taken the idea that two men can be close and intimate and physical and they can hug each other and kiss each other. That happens in men's locker rooms all the time. Do all these things and still be perceived as masculine and not be disparaged based on their actions. However, it can also kind of portray orthodox masculinity in the sense that some literature suggests that the openness to show these emotions and really demonstrate these connections is a way of reinforcing orthodox masculinity. The thought process behind that is that if you were truly gay, you wouldn't be comfortable demonstrating this kind of physical connection and emotional connection with other players in front of everyone else in the locker room. If you were truly gay, you wouldn't just kiss another man in the locker room in front of everyone. You'd be uncomfortable to do so. So it's kind of a bit of both. Bromance, it's a progression in today's sport where men can show emotion and don't have to display stereotypical masculinity. But there is the theory that in doing so, they are actually reinforcing hegemonic masculinity in the sense that they're like, oh, I'm straight, I can do this, and I'm comfortable doing this. So it's another side of it. I also want to put a picture of Gareth Thomas on this slide because look at him. If we're taking stereotypical masculinity, that he's the definition of that. He's a fit, physical, attractive man, and yet gay men can't play physical sports. Gay men can't play rugby. He has to be physical to show that, or to give the perception that he's straight. That just doesn't make sense. So moving on here. Now let's go a bit more specific to men's rugby. And so inclusion in men's rugby. Now, rugby is kind of unique because it's commonly listed alongside football as a leading definer of masculinity at universities. I believe this is taken from British studies, so they don't specify what football is, but it might mean soccer for North American terminology. But regardless, it is saying that the perception is a very masculine sport. It's a macho sport. Now, male rugby athletes also frequently participate in actions that reinforce the hegemonic masculinity. This is part of the game. They are aggressive and they are physical, but also outside of the game, they sexualize women and they display their strength and macho-ness compared to the others on the team. That's just part of the culture. Uh, this kind of masculinity and inclusion is also prevalent in women's rugby, whereas due to the masculine nature of sport, females are typically not assumed heterosexual. This is kind of an interesting topic. My supervisor, Dr. William Bridle, has done a lot of work with women's figure skating, and it's found that there are virtually no lesbians in figure skating. Now, how does this relate to rugby? Well, the idea is that figure skating is a feminine sport. So the women that are displaying stereotypical femininity can't be lesbian. They have to be straight. They are females. They're women participating in a feminine sport. Therefore making them, they have to be straight. So that's why there are no lesbians. Now, rugby kind of works the same in the sense that there are no gay men in rugby. Well, there are. Gareth Thomas is a great example, and others have come out. But the perception is that there isn't because it's such a masculine sport. You can't be masculine and be gay. Apparently that doesn't make sense to society. So women's rugby kind of takes that and turns it on its head. So the literature that has looked at inclusion in rugby has really focused on primarily women's rugby and the idea that there must be lesbians in women's rugby because it's a masculine sport. All women who play rugby are kind of perceived as lesbian until almost proven otherwise, which is just ironic how different that is from other sports. Because the women athletes that are playing rugby are displaying the masculinity that is associated with lesbians. So it's a little bit different of an inclusion, but it really demonstrates how masculinity can be such a prevalent and powerful topic of how inclusion is portrayed in sports. So therefore, as I kind of mentioned before, research has really not looked into men's rugby. And maybe this is a result of the sociocultural aspects of masculinity and thinking that there is no need to look into gay men in rugby because where are they? That's just not the case. And that's one of the reasons why this is my topic and something that's super fascinating, in my opinion. I'd like to move on now because I've dove really deep into the concept of rugby and inclusion and everything that kind of comes with that. But I haven't defined inclusion yet. So what am I striving for? What kind of inclusion am I looking to achieve with my work and just in sport? The funny thing is I don't think there's an answer. Right here, we have 3 different studies in the literature that display 3 different definitions of inclusion and how they portray it in their paper. The first definition by Winters states that inclusion is the creation of an environment that acknowledges, welcomes, and accepts different approaches. Okay, how I read this is individuality. It is describing inclusion as the ability for individuals to maintain their individuality and still be accepted. However, by Shore et al. In 2011, their definition was that inclusion has emphasis on belonging at the expense of the employees, we're talking athletes, but uniqueness induces assimilation as in a cultural process. So my takeaway of this, and like I said, we're going to take on employees and we're going to pretend it's athletes, but it's that they're saying that in order to belong in a group or a team or a company, you are inherently losing some of your individuality as you are conforming to the group identity. Now I want to move on to the third one, which isn't necessarily a definition, but it's just the concept that inclusion is in nature a subjective perspective. Now that's just kind of unique because say I'm included in a situation and my friend over here isn't. I'll say it's inclusive, they won't. So it is a subjective idea. Now the other idea is where can we use inclusion? Where is it individuality or is it belonging or is it both? And if it is both, how does that work? In my head, I like to use a kind of a diagram. And so I'm picturing there are 10 different individuals lined up. Where they stand in this line is a determinant of their individuality. This person here is different than the person beside them. Now, let's say we have an umbrella that is inclusion. If two people have that umbrella, in order for others to be included, we have to take them and their individuality and move them underneath the umbrella. But by doing that, we are kind of changing their individual to conform to the group of that umbrella and conform to that identity. Now, I propose the idea that if we have the 10 people now lined up, what if we make the umbrella cover them all without moving them? Keep everyone's individuality the exact same, but instead change the concept of belonging to include everyone, to cover everyone, to protect everyone. That's the kind of inclusion I personally believe sport and a lot of other things need to strive for. I do not know how we get there, but we need people to maintain their identities while belonging and while being included. I'd like you all to think about your personal definition of inclusion and what that means to you, because I don't think there's a right answer. I don't think what I just described is the right answer. I don't know if there is a right answer, but there are multiple different perspectives on what inclusion may look like to you. So really, please think about that question. I want to move on now because I am talking about, I don't know how to implement inclusion, but I want to talk about, a potential idea of leaders and activists. And the idea of, okay, maybe they can start the change. And that makes sense because in this study by Hallbrook et al. In 2019, they identified that coaches are the single most influential person on sport teams. Now they result this to the role in setting the precedent of the team culture. Now, that's great news. We kind of know who to target. We target the coaches as they create the environment for the players. And they drive home the values and beliefs of these teams. Unfortunately, other studies have found that 75% of all coaches claim to value inclusion space. Okay, that's pretty good. But 50% of coaches directly address inclusion within their teams. So what I mean by that is kind of, why is there disparity? Why are we saying coaches value inclusion, yet only half of them actually act on this value and actually enforce inclusion within their teams? Why is there this disparity? And the disparity may be larger. These studies use interviews to collect their data, and no one wants to say I'm not inclusive. So I'm not saying that these studies aren't correct, but very well the gap could be larger, the gap could be smaller. But really, why is there a disparity at all? Why do people value inclusion but not acting on it? And that's where I want to bring up my next term. And this is the idea of the glass closet. So as pretty much everyone's familiar with the glass ceiling, the glass closet is kind of a similar concept. So the glass ceiling, being that women in the workplace primarily, can only progress so far because there's this invisible ceiling that limits them. Now, this invisible ceiling is made from the inclusive policies and practices that businesses and companies preach and that are in place, but really they're not acted on. There's a lot of other issues too, but just as a quick summary. The glass closet in this case is kind of similar on that, in the sense that there are teams who will say, oh yeah, we're inclusive. Look at all, like, we have this policy in place saying anyone can play, yet they won't have an openly gay player on their team. They won't have an LGBTQI2S plus individual on their team. So, okay, well, why is that? And it's the idea that, yeah, we can say all we want, that they could be included, they would be included, but we don't see it actually happen. So it's kind of this idea of glass closet, whereas we're in a society that we're trying to progress to be inclusive and accepting of everyone, LGBTQI2S plus, everyone. However, without really acting on these policies or acting inclusive ourselves, we're kind of we're painting this picture that in our heads looks so great of us being inclusive, but in practice isn't actually getting to the populations that are in need of this inclusion. So I suggest that this might be a reason for this disparity, in the sense that the 50 coaches who say they directly address inclusion, do they really address inclusion? I don't know. maybe they say, oh yeah, we have this sign on the wall that says everyone's welcome, and that's us being inclusive. Well, how powerful and how effective is that really? So the glass closet's a topic that I think should gain some steam in the upcoming years, especially when we talk about sports and LGBTQI2S plus populations. Unfortunately, though, when we talk about the glass closet, the coaches, the leaders who we have decided and we have found out have a large pull in the sport community, they believe that having a gay athlete on the team would cause a distraction. So do they really want to be inclusive then? And now I also want to apologize for the strong terminology in the next two quotes, but I find that these descriptions of coaches really drive home the environment that is currently active in sport. So one athlete says that coaches use terms such as poof, faggot, pussy, along with a number of other misogynistic terms with regular frequency in their sport and in their practices. Another quote by another athlete in the rugby study as well says that when another player tells his coach that he does not think he should practice because of an ankle injury, the coach says, "For God's sake, what are you, gay?" Ouch. Now let's jump back to Gareth Thomas's passage I read you. That is the reason that he needs to be macho and physical. Or it might be the reason. But yeah, he needs to do those things in order to prove to his opponent that he was straight and just as much of a man as everyone else on the field. Weakness is now and has been a synonym with gay and a synonym for when in men's sport people call, "What are you, a girl?" Same sort of idea. So we need to change these coaches' beliefs as well. And that might be where this starts. Once again, I do not know the answers. Now, as I kind of finish my presentation here, I want to kind of bring up the idea of what does social activism mean to you? Now, I have a group chat with a lot of my friends, and to be fair, my friends are primarily all white, as far as I know, heterosexual males, roughly my age, from 20 to 25, and fairly well off. So I don't, by no means is this an overarching reason, but I asked them, I said, what does social activism mean to you? And these are some of the answers they gave me. And really what I wanted to underline was that a lot of them recognize systemic inequality and the idea of trying to recognize and understand inequality, or trying to understand and trying to create a better place by immersing yourself in it. Now, in this case of these individuals being in a position of privilege with our white, able-bodied, cisgender, heterosexual males in society, what does this look like? I've read a couple of papers that say that this looks like the idea of setting the stage for others to speak. We should not speak for others. We have the stage to do that, but it doesn't mean we should do that. We have the privilege of having people's attention and people listening. But what we need to do is support the people around us so that they can voice their struggles, their identity, their culture, their inequalities, their discrimination to the masses. Now, activism is very different for a lot of different people. You can be active on social media. You can be active in person. You can be active in a lot of different ways. But kind of like the inclusion, I don't know if there's one right way. I don't think there is. But I'd like you to think about what does activism mean to you? And if you want to be an activist, what path will you take? Leading to my closing point. Now, this is a picture from Kananaskis. And actually, I did this hike. It's a great hike, but it's a picture of a path. And I know this might be cheesy, but I like to think that this is my path. This path is leading towards the top of the mountain in this case. And to me, what's at the top of the mountain is inclusion, inequality. And in my case, I'm really looking for in sport, but just in general. Now, my path has a lot of twists and turns that other paths may not. My path has to do with my identity and my position of privilege. It also has to do with my education and educating myself on these topics. But what's key is that this is not everyone's path. Everyone has a different path. And so, kind of how I view this is that we all have one common goal. We all want to be good people, and we want to be inclusive, and we want to create an inclusive environment in sport. But we all are at different starting places. Some may be farther ahead, some people may be farther behind. It doesn't make one person better than another. What it does mean, though, is that you can help people on other paths. Some paths might even come together and you can work together. But if you see someone who may not be far along on their path, encourage them, help them out, give them a different perspective, educate them. Now, make sure you don't do this in a way that is condescending, but the idea that everyone is trying to come to the same place, and really keeping in mind that the way to that same place is different for everyone, and you do not possess the ability to choose the right way to get there for them to get to their place. At least I don't believe. There are many different paths. We're looking for inclusion. Inclusion in sport needs to happen. Thank you everyone for listening to my presentation. I will put up my references next. I really hope that this provided some thought-provoking topics for you to discuss. My name is Alice Brent Johnson. I hope you have a fantastic day.